In previous videos, we've looked at labor demand and labor supply separately, and we're now going to pull them together and look at how the market determines how much output and the price. And specifically in sports economics or labor economics, how many units of labor and at what wage. So we talked about individual demand and individual supply. The market demand and market supply is the horizontal sum of all individual demand and supply curves. Okay. And so you can see demand of labor is the sum of all individual demands. Demand of supply is the sum of all individual supplies. So when you talk about equilibrium, equilibrium is where demand equals supply. All right, so if you have the initial demand and initial supply, you're going to find that the market's going to push the equilibrium to this point here of WE and LE. So an increase in demand or supply is going to alter, or decrease in demand supply is going to alter that equilibrium point. So let's say, for example, that the labor demand increases from DL to DL prime. So if the equilibrium was to say this WE point, you would have more units supplied than are demanded. And so the market will adjust to that by moving to that new equilibrium point, and which will end up being a higher wage and a higher amount of labor employed. So just looking at this change in demand. So basketball became much more popular in the 1980s. And so when this happened, the demand to see NBA games both in person and on TV rose. And this increased the value of each player's contribution because, again, the player's value is the marginal revenue product of labor. And so if them playing is now bringing in more revenue than before because the demand is just higher, okay, you're going to see the value go up as the demand to watch the games goes up. And so this is going to cause the demand for labor to increase. Okay? So when you go from the demand to DL 978 to DL 2009, all right, and when that happens, you see the wages of players go up as well as the number of workers that are employed. Now, in 2008, there were declining tickets. This caused the marginal revenue, so this during the previous economic downturn, this caused the marginal revenue product labor players to decline. So you would expect the wages would go down. Okay. So what happened? So again, so we had 78, 2009, but then you had 2008 here. So from 78 to 2008, the wage went up, and then if you go to 2009, it went down because the demand fell, and in response, there was fewer paid in salaries. Now, the number of jobs that are available in general is partially determined by roster size. So roster limits are negotiated by team owners in the Players Association. So for example, in the NBA, there can only be, I believe, 12 active players. Okay. Now they can play, theoretically, if the teams wanted to, they could have 30 players and play all of them. But they have the roster limits, and the NFL is probably a better example because the NFL has 53 players on their active game day roster, and so because of that, there's only so many players that can be on the team. So when that happens, you have this restriction here. All right. And so in this figure, the equilibrium employment level, all right, so if the market was competitive, would be here at LE, but you have a roster limit, which is shown by this LR here. And so with the LR, what ends up happening is the number of players ends up being decreased, but because of the lower demand, which this ends up being, you have the higher wage. So one of the reasons why a lot of unions for the players will end up pushing for some sort of roster limits is so that the teams don't just bring in so many players that each player is not making as much. So this is just a broad overview of the equilibrium in the labor market of sports.